mean to misbehave.
You there! Stand fast!
I think I broke something.
Have you ever experienced deja vu? I mean, it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? It seems like history repeats itself. Well, maybe not exactly. I don't know about you, but from where I sit, it sure seems to rhyme. The funny thing is, when they tell you it's new, it's not. It's just been repackaged. How do you know? You just have to know where to look. Well, I'm looking. Hello and welcome. I'm Lewis, and I'll be your host. So, ready or not, I'll switch on the lights. Come on in and join me, and we'll put some light on it on the Red Pill Diary. The guest stood in the dimly lit, stuffy interior room the general's aide had whisked him into to avoid prying eyes. The dark-haired, well-dressed man entered the room alone and closed the door behind him. His highly polished boots accented his smartly pressed light gray uniform. He abruptly stopped as he turned to greet his guest, his mouth now slightly open and a frown on his face. He was shocked when he saw the British officer standing holding a Colt revolver pointing directly at his chest. His eyes moved up from the revolver, and he looked directly at the officer before him. "I'm here to arrest you, General," the officer stated flatly, quickly removing the general's revolver. The officer could sense the general's mind quickly contemplating his options, weighing his possibilities of survival. Or, he continued stressing this word, "I could shoot you." He finished, hoping the latter would help the general's decision-making process. So far, he had met the first conditions of this operation, to take the general alive. However, the second requirement, without creating a disturbance, was still unfulfilled, but things were looking up for the general and for him as well. The moments passed, the general's face softened, and he glanced at the table to his left next to the sofa with 2 glasses, an uncorked bottle of Shiraz, an assortment of crackers, fruit, and cheese, a table set for a previous engagement. "It would be a shame to waste such a bottle to the unsophisticated, wouldn't you agree?" he stated with a smile. The officer nodded affirmatively, continuing to hold the revolver steady. The general slowly picked up the glass, swirled the contents, and drank. He smiled, corked the bottle, and placed it under his arm. "Shall we go?" he said. The officer motioned to the window, where a car awaited outside. It was a short and uneventful ride to the rendezvous point, where an officer and 6 men were waiting to take the general to the next destination. The officer opened the passenger door, and the general stepped out of the vehicle, brushed himself off, adjusted his jacket, and then reached back in the sedan and collected his things. He looked at the bottle of wine, waited momentarily, looked up, smiled, and then handed the British officer the bottle of Shiraz. "I won't be needing this where I'm going," he said, extending his right hand. "Thank you for the courtesies. I would like to think I would have done the same." The British officer took the bottle in his left hand, shook the general's hand, and watched him walk to the other vehicle and enter the car's back seat. The drab-colored sedan disappeared into the desert and the darkness, leaving only a cloud of sand and the headlights bouncing along the dirt road as the car retreated into the distance. "I doubt the general would have treated him the same," he said as he looked at the bottle and its label. "It was only a short ride to the landing field and then to places unknown. No," he thought, "the general would not need the bottle of wine where he was going. Operation Pongo was a success, and he would drink to that." It was December 7th, 1942. Now for the backstory. Our focus initially is going to be on the tense rivalry between Russia and Great Britain. This is in Central Asia. It concerned 3 countries, Afghanistan, Iran, and Tibet. They created a geographical barrier between these 2 powers. Now, in 1901, the Shah in Persia granted this British subject a 60-year concession in all areas of the country of Iran or Persia, except for the 5 northern provinces bordering Russia. That's important because it's going to come back up as a conflict later on. And essentially, it allowed this British subject carte blanche exploration and transportation relating to the oil that he would or could or should maybe find in Persia. But he had to provide 16%, the Shah, 16% royalty on all net profits for operation. So let's fast forward to the first 10 years of 1900. In 1905, Imperial Germany started to emerge as a power. Russia was defeated in the Russo-Japanese War. And in 1907, Great Britain and Russia met in St. Petersburg and signed the Anglo-Russian Convention. It didn't consult Iran. It attempted to enable both these powers to outflank the rising power of Germany, because Germany at the time was contemplating a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad, this way potentially uniting Imperial Germany and the Ottoman Empire, which extended at that time to what we know modern-day Kuwait. This, for the Germans, would strategically open the potential for access to the Persian Gulf, to the Sea of Oman, and into the Arabian Sea, thereby avoiding the Suez Canal, which was built in 1869 and was currently under protection by the British government. It also outflanked the newly formed government of Persia, which it didn't consult about their agreement, and Persia, Iran, refused to recognize the validity of the agreement. Essentially, it carved out Persia into three sections of influence. Russia to the north, and Great Britain in the south, with the center being neutral between the two of them, where each one could have influence. They set the borders of Afghanistan and Tibet, and this arrangement allowed both of them to manipulate Persia politically and economically. This created a pretty heavy anti-British sentiment and really an anti-West attitude. Now you asked, why is that important? Because it shows you the underlying stewing of things occurring in this area based on the conduct of the powers at the turn of the 20th century. It's only going to get worse. Okay, so in 1908, Darcy finds oil, and he finds it big. And that same year, he creates the Anglo-Iranian Oil. It was initially called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, but you now know it as BP, as in British Petroleum. Right after this, the British government obtained a 51% stake in the company, and practically this company controlled all the oil in Iran. Let's jump to 1917. Now, we know that's important for a number of reasons, but in this case, it concerns Russia. Now, Russia was consumed by civil war, Bolshevik Revolution, and they canceled all the debts with Tsarist Russia and Iran, Persia, basically renounced most of their rights in Iran. Of course, Britain moved in to fill the void at the height of its imperial power, and under the Balfour Declaration, it controlled Palestine and de facto Iran. So let's take a deep breath and just stop and recap. Essentially, Great Britain occupied most of the Middle East and carved up Persia with Russia. And during this time, the British subject obtains a sweetheart deal with the Shah of Persia regarding any oil he could or would find, creates through financial assistance and basically political backing an oil company, and the British government obtains a 51% stake, then increases it to 53%, basically taking control and providing oil to its navy at reduced prices. What a deal. It went through essentially a straw man to get what it could not have gotten as a sovereign nation negotiating with a sovereign nation. So why was this important, especially to Britain? Now, the British, of course, had a huge investment in this refinery in Iran. And it was important to the British and the Iranian economies, but more so to the British because they were recovering from what? World War II. So now we're in 1950. And so this money that's generated from this refinery is helping to pay for their debt. And to remove this refinery's income for the British would have a devastating effect on the British economy. And they didn't want that to happen, and nor do they want to lose those profits. Okay, I want to take a moment to stop and make a point. In the last episode, and this one, and we're going to see going forward, there's at least three things that you're going to see repeating itself. One, the competition for a natural resource. Two, the fear of some outside influence that the other party sees as a detriment to themselves. And three, some mechanism by which to increase the profit for the private company's power to get a sovereign to do its work to protect it so they continue to make a profit in that country. So you say, well, that's a lot of information. What's the point? Well, the point is we're starting to build a template to show how these entities take advantage, for lack of a better term, of another sovereign resources for their advantage. Because they believe, they being the sovereigns, those who see themselves more sophisticated than the people who are actually controlling or should have control over those resources, don't want those individuals controlling it because they don't trust them to do what's in the best interest of the sovereign that's controlling the country. Of course, they're not going to do what's in the best interest of the sovereign controlling the country. They're going to do what's in the best interest of them and their government, well, regardless of whether or not we agree with it or not. That's what they should do. Do we say, hey, you know what? The rest of the world, do you mind telling us what we should do with whatever resource we have in this country? Of course, we don't ask them. But if someone comes in and starts to try to control our resources, boy, I tell you, isn't there a lot of hubbub about that? Just think about, 10 years ago. Who sold off our uranium? Remember that? That was a big hubbub. How about selling off the property next to Air Force bases or military installations? What about that? What about selling property to other countries who now control those assets in our country? Isn't that a big deal? Of course it is. It's also a big deal for them. So now we got the underlying flavor for the dynamic that's going on in this area of the globe. Let's talk about the cast of characters. We have, of course, the British and its Secret Service. We have the CIA. At this time, the deputy director of the CIA was none other than Allen Dulles. Now, Truman was the president initially, and Acheson was the Secretary of State, but Allen Dulles was the deputy director of the CIA. John Dulles will become the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, and, of course, Allen Dulles will become the director of the CIA under Eisenhower. And batting for the CIA in this matter is none other than Kermit Roosevelt. Yes, the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. Remember I told you how families and political people tend to show up in different generations and are related to each other? Well, here again is another one. So in 1951, the Shah of Iran basically yielded to popular pressure and appointed a guy named Mohammad Mosaddeq to be Iran's new prime minister. He was a lawyer. He was a wealthy landowner. He had been a prominent political figure in Iran since 1900s. He gained reputation as a liberal Democrat, and he was an ardent nationalist. And by 1940s, he was identified two main issues: transfer the political party from the royal court, that's the Shah, to the parliament, known as the Majlis, and a desire to increase Iran's control over what? The oil industry, which was controlled by who? The British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC. Because what happens when you nationalize something? The government takes control over it. Who owned it before? The British. Who owns it now? The Iranians. That would be a problem for who? The British. So now you know why we give the backstory, because you can see that the fuse is lit. And now someone plans on misbehaving. And we know who that would be. That would be the British. And if the British can't get it done by themselves, who are they going to call? The CIA. And that's exactly what they did. So the strategy of the British, either pressure Mosaddeq into a favorable settlement to them, as in Britain, Great Britain, or remove him from office. And they were going to do it by either a series of legal maneuvers, either the International Court of Justice, or they're going to do it by undermine Mossaddeq's base of support and finally remove him from office. Now, how does that happen, you say? Well, it's usually through covert political action. They got a network of pro-British politicians, businessmen, military officers, and religious figures to speak out against him, and they needed to find a replacement. Someone more aligned with their perspective, meaning someone they could control. This wasn't about in the interest of the Iranian people. It was centered on the interest of Great Britain. So who was the person that they had in mind to replace Mosaddeq? Enter General Fozollah Zahedi. Remember him? Well, now he's back. Apparently, he doesn't have any bad feelings with the British after they kidnapped him by gunpoint, but here he is back and favorable to the British. The British start this plot for Zahedi and the Rashidians to plot against Mosaddeq after his arrival in July of that year. Now, is this starting to sound familiar? Now, think about the previous episode with Lumumba. Now, Lumumba and that assassination in the Congo was in the 1960s, a decade in the future. This is the 1950s. It's the same time these German scientists are still working on all this stuff going on for the CIA. So all this is still going on when they initially start this action in Iran. And they follow in the 1960s with Lumumba. The problem for the British is Mosaddeq is very aware of what's going on, and he kicks the British out of the country. Enter the CIA and Mr. Kermit Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt likely had the Rashidian brothers and others transported to the CIA headquarters and trained in the United States. And Roosevelt used these individuals on a four-pronged assault to depose Mohammad Mosaddeq. He got rioters from the slums, and they had them rampaging through the streets, shouting their allegiance to communism and against Mosaddeq. They had the fake, what they call communist group is Tuda, or a party aligned with supposedly Moscow. And they were shouting things like, "Death to Mosaddeq, long live the Shah." They were breaking windows. They beat innocent bystanders. They shot at the mosques and generally aroused the outrage of citizens. They had patriotic mobs that would supposedly suppress these rowdies, preferably with the help of friendly police officers. Then they tore down statues, rampaged at will, which showed the country basically, or people saw it sinking or in trouble, needing a quote-unquote rescuer. Then they created anti-American activities for which the ambassador would complain to Mosaddeq, who apparently had a soft spot for Americans. And Roosevelt used this to his advantage because turmoil was the goal. And it worked. He fled to avoid being killed by the rioters outside of his house at the last moment, and fled to the area of Iran where he had the most favorable component of supporters. And who was sitting in the wings being prepared to be prime minister on the vote of the parliament and the recommendation of the Shah? You guessed it, General Saidi, the same one who was captured by the British at gunpoint, interred in Palestine for the duration of the war. He's now the prime minister of Iran, who happened to be pro-British and pro-West, just what the doctor had ordered. So what was the final outcome of the 53 coup in Iran? It slowed and basically halting the progress that Iran had been making since the 1900s towards a more representative form of government, thanks to the American and British intervention. In the years after the coup, the authoritarian regime was gradually consolidated in Iran with massive assistance from the United States. Martial law was installed and remained in effect for several years. Dissenting supporters were arrested and pro-Mosaddeq demonstrations were broken up. Successor political entities were suppressed, press censorship was initiated, and basically a secret police force was established and involved into the notorious Savak. And guess who trained the police force initially? Major General Herbert Norman Schwarzkopf. That would be the father of the General Schwarzkopf of Operation Desert Storm. I told you that there's family involvement in a lot of these cases, and here's another example. So what happened between the United States and Great Britain? British Petroleum was forced to accept membership in this consortium of companies that brought Iranian oil back on the international market, and essentially it had to give interest in its company to American oil companies, not to the American people, to the American oil companies. Not that we should have gotten the benefit from it, but don't let them tell you they did it for the benefit of your country. They did it for the benefit of the oil companies. Is it any wonder that these countries don't like us and shout hate slogans towards us, when only us look at history to see sometimes we're our worst enemy? Now, let's land this airplane. So put your seat backs in the upright position and your test tables back in its normal position and prepare for landing, because we aim to get serious. Now, I'll stop here and think about what they did to successfully overthrow Mosaddeq, who was duly elected by the parliament. They essentially had rioters rampaging through the street, creating trouble, shouting death to so-and-so, long live somebody else, breaking windows, they're beating in at bystanders, they're shooting at the mosques, and they generally aroused the outrage of the citizen. Does that sound familiar? How about 4 years ago? That looked like anything you saw around here? Well, then they had these mobs that would come up and supposedly suppress the rowdies, and then the help of the police would help them. Does that sound familiar? Well, they tore down statues and rampaged at will. So it provided, or at least gave the impression that the country was sinking into trouble and they needed, quote unquote, a rescuer. Well, guess what? Do you see that happening now? Before? Ask yourself, where have you seen this before? Not just in 1950s and 1960s, but you're going to see this over and over again. This is a pattern. This is the whole point. Watch these patterns. Watch what they do, because they're going to repeat them. They've done it in the past. Why wouldn't they do it now? I'm not saying one way or the other, but there sure are a lot of similarities between this and 1950 and what we see going on in our country even today. I'm just saying, something to think about. So let me close by asking this one very serious question. As we learn about history and about the things that has transpired, and we start to look at the things that are going on around us, we have to ask this question. If they did it there, will they do it here? If they're doing it here, what would be the indication that it's occurring? We can't play ostrich. We have to at least recognize the possibility that it could happen even here. And like Harry Truman said, there is nothing new in the world except the history you do not know. I'll leave the lights on for you. Well, we filled those pages. If you have comments, suggestions, share them. You know, the more input, the more likely a better outcome. I'm moving forward, because backwards is not an option. I've turned the lights on here, and I'll be leaving it that way. Join me next time on The Red Pill Diary.